What's going on, guys? It's Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 336 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I have another Batman book that I want to talk to you about. This is Tales of the Batman, Carmine Infantino. This collects several Batman comics from the mid-1960s, and then it collects a handful of Brave and the Bold issues from the early 1980s, and then it collects one kind of reunion issue from 2004, I think, that is also illustrated by Carmine Infantino. They did the same thing in the Tales of the Batman Lin Wein edition. They collected a whole bunch of comics from the late 70s, early 80s, and then they collected one comic from like 2004. But this is Carmine Infantino's work on the Batman. I think that there was a volume 2 that I either saw it solicited or it just recently came out. So this isn't everything that he did on Batman, but this is quite a bit of the stuff that he did on this title. And usually stuff from DC Comics in the 1960s doesn't really do it for me, but I found myself very compelled by this volume. I really liked it quite a bit. It surprised me that I enjoyed it as much as I did. And I think part of it is with Batman. Whenever I think of Batman in the Silver Age, I think of zebra-striped costumes, and I think of him punching aliens and getting in spaceships and going to other planets. I think of all this really weird and wacky stuff that we just don't see Batman doing anymore. But then when you look at this, and the first issue collected here is from 1966, which in my opinion, that is smack dab in the middle of the Silver Age, he's not doing any of that stuff. This is all him doing somewhat grim and gritty stuff. He's punching earthbound bad guys. He's not really doing anything super wild and crazy. You could see him doing most of the stuff that he does in this book. If it was set in the present day, it would just be a little bit of a tonal shift. It's not quite as brooding as the Batman that we've come to know over the last 30 years or so. That's really the only difference between something that you would see here and something you would see in the year 2017. I really like this quite a bit. I think this was just right around the time when the TV show started. I think the TV show starting kind of kicked everyone at DC into high gear, where they said, okay, we kind of need to rejuvenate Batman a little bit. He doesn't need to go around fighting people from alternate dimensions and going in spaceships and stuff like that. We need to kind of sort of rein him in a little bit, make it a little bit more like what he was doing back in the late 30s, early 40s, where he's fighting gangsters and mob bosses and stuff like that, and not necessarily aliens from the sixth dimension or whatever. So I really like this. It surprised me quite a bit. Not only that, but there were actually things in this book that I did not know about. I thought that I knew pretty much everything there was to know about Batman. Maybe that sounds a little bit arrogant, but I thought that I had a pretty good handle on the history of the character, but there were things here that surprised me. For example, the character of the Clue Master, who is the father of Spoiler, who is a character from the 90s. I just assumed that he was also introduced in the 90s, but he was actually introduced in this volume. Carmine Infantino was a co-creator of the character. I did not know that. I did not know that he was introduced in the 60s. Now, admittedly, he probably didn't do that much in between his introduction here and whenever we were introduced to Spoiler, because he is basically just a second-hand Riddler, but I still thought that was kind of neat that he had his roots going all the way back to the Silver Age. Also, whenever Batgirl is introduced, Barbara Gordon, you get to see her introduction here, and it's kind of interesting. She is quite a bit older than Robin. You get the feeling here that Robin hasn't yet entered college. At one point, Batman is talking about how soon Robin will be entering college, and he's telling Dick, like, hey, you may want to stay in tonight and do your homework. So he's not yet college age. He might be high school age. I'm not really sure. But Batgirl, she has already graduated college, and she's working in a library. So you get the sense that she is much closer to Batman's age than she is Robin's age. But then, whenever you get to the Post-Crisis on Infinite Earths Batman books, Robin and Batgirl, they are much closer in age together. And in fact, they are kind of romantically involved in many stories that I've seen. And so looking at this, where she is much closer to Batman's age, looking at Batman the Animated Series, where I was always grossed out by Batgirl having a crush on Batman and those two eventually having a relationship, I can kind of see where they were coming from now, since there is a little bit of a precedent for that, where these two are closer in age in the 1960s, but it's still a little bit gross in the animated series because she's still Robin's age, and then she's crushing on a dude who's like 20 years older than her. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. You do get to see the introduction of Barbara Gordon, who in my opinion is probably the most well-known Batgirl. Before this, there was a couple of other characters who wore that name. In fact, at one point they even call her the new Batgirl because of Betty Kane, who was Batgirl before Barbara. But the only other thing that I have to say about this is kind of a general complaint I have about any time a book is collected where it is an artist's book. For example, Carmine Infantino, he was the artist on all of these books, but he was not the writer. Sometimes you will see a story that begins in one issue, and then you don't get to see the conclusion of that story because the artist that is being celebrated with that book was not involved in every issue in that story. And for the most part, you don't have that here because most of this is from the late 60s. You didn't really have a whole lot of multi-issue storylines going on back then, but there was one particular moment that kind of floored me a little bit, not really, but kind of, where at the end of one of the issues with Batgirl, we get to see a little post-credit scene, if you will, where Catwoman is reading the newspaper and she's saying, oh, Batgirl's trying to move in on my man, well, I'll show her, and then we don't get to see the follow-up to that, because apparently Carmine Infantino did not draw the follow-up that had Catwoman trying to convince Batgirl to leave Batman alone. So that's a little disappointing. That's really the only time that we see anything like that here. We don't really see a whole lot of storylines progressing from issue to issue in this book, because that wasn't really something that was done a whole lot in the mid-60s. Now, if this was stuff from the mid-70s, we would have seen quite a bit of that, and it would have been a little frustrating seeing Carmine Infantino jump from this issue to 3 issues down the line, and then we're skipping a lot of the subplots and stuff that are being touched on in each issue. Fortunately, there's only really one moment of that happening in this book, so for the most part, I think that I can very wholeheartedly recommend this book without any reservations at all. If you are a little bit hesitant about the Silver Age stuff with Batman, like I was, I would recommend this. I think that it's very good. If you like the 1960s television series, in my opinion, this is actually a little stronger than what I've seen from the TV show. I know a lot of people really like the TV show. I've only seen a few episodes here and there, but I think that this is actually a little bit better than the TV show. A little bit more smartly written. The characters don't feel as much like a joke as they did in that show. That's not meant to be a complaint against the show, but that does feel like something they were aiming for with that show. But it does not feel like what they were trying to go for here. So I definitely recommend Tales of the Batman, Carmine Infantino. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to come back tomorrow where I will be talking about another book. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.